We Christians don't make peace with death the way Buddhists do, where they just say, I'm looking at the darkness, and you know what? I'm just going to let go of this delusion that I exist anyway, and then melt into the nothing, right? No. That's not Christian, quote, enlightenment. We make peace with death by getting real close to it, looking it in the eye and saying, I win. In Jesus Christ, I win. Because the love of God overcame, overpowered, overthrew the tyranny of death. In the words of St. Paul, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? We still experience it, we still have its pain, but Jesus conquered. And this is kind of a wild thing. Since Jesus rose from the dead and delivered humanity from the fear of death, we've Christians been at this for so long, we almost take it for granted. We have this generally positive worldview that things all work out okay in the end. Guys, that's TM trademark Jesus Christ. We didn't have that before the resurrection. This is the most important moment in history, the moment that Jesus, boom, rose from the dead. If only we had a snapshot, if only we had a picture of that moment. Hey, turns out we do. We're going to talk about the picture of that moment. That is the Shroud of Turin, the overwhelming, growing amount of evidence that the Shroud of Turin is what Christians have been claiming it is for millennia. And I have one of the most brilliant minds in the Catholic Church, Father Spitzer, here to talk about that with me today. Thanks for being with us. Super quick commercial before we dive into the topic of today. I lead pilgrimages to the Holy Land every year. Go to reallifecatholic.com, check that out. Dr. Tim Gray also leads pilgrimages to the Holy Land. You just Google either of our names and Holy Land. I don't care who the heck you go with. I want every Christian to go to the Holy Land. A lot of Catholics have it in their minds, I need to go to Rome before I die. Rome's cool. The tomb of Peter's cool. Standing in the empty tomb of Jesus is next level cool. So please, no offense, Peter, please come with one of us someday. And Father Spitzer, thank you so much.
Oh, great to be with you again, Chris.
Oh my gosh, I could sit and hang out with you and have coffee every single day and talk about this stuff. A
lot to it.
Yeah, Larry Smith, he's a right-hand man. He's like, I'm thinking of the questions for these shows. He's like, dude, just hit play. Father Spitzer's he'll be all like a team of horses.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Before we dive into the science of the shroud, for those who never heard of it, give me a brief summary. What is the Shroud of Turin?
The Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot long linen cloth by 3.5 feet. It has a herringbone twill weave on it with very expensive weave and linen that was used. It is purported to be the burial cloth of Jesus. I think there's a substantial amount of evidence for it. On the shroud, you can see a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image emblazoned on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. The image emblazoned on the cloth is a photographic negative. So if you actually take a picture of it and look at the negative of the picture you just took, you will see Jesus as he, I believe that's Jesus, as he really looked. And you will not only see the positive image of Jesus, you will see inside of him as well. So as we'll discuss momentarily, you can see like the bones in his hand and the flesh around the bones in perfect three-dimensional layering. So you can have these, VD, 8 analyzers that can basically see the three-dimensional layering on the shroud. And these things in turn, for example, you look at the backbone and the flesh surrounding the backbone, you can see that this cloth actually not only captures the outside, the surface, but the inside of the person in perfect three-dimensional layering. It's absolutely remarkable. The origin of that image.
We're 30 seconds in. I'm like, okay, I'm sold.
Yeah. It's like it's the most unusual image in the whole history of images in the world, and it is the most scientifically analyzed image or a historical artifact in the history of artifacts in the world. I mean, by far, like way by far.
Wow.
So we're talking about hundreds of tests that have been scientific tests already performed on the shroud. But additionally, on that shroud, in addition to the image, are 372 blood stains.
372
blood stains, yeah. 205, I believe, on the back and something like 159 or something on the front. I hope that adds up to pretty close to 372.
What a meditation on the passion that is.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It contains almost line by line. It contains the gospel accounts of Jesus' highly unusual crucifixion, right? We only have one crucifixion with a crown of thorns in history, Jesus. We only have one crucifixion where there's, a spear that is thrown into the man's side and it outpours blood and water, which you can see the pleural fluid that looks, transparent, and the blood that's coming out of that wound between the fifth and the sixth ribs going up at a 30-degree angle as the spear is
They can actually tell the angle based on the shroud.
You can use the angle, and you can also tell the shape, the elliptical shape, the leaf-like shape of the spearhead of the Roman legionary spear that is thrust up. You can see it in the wound, and right around the wound is congealed blood and also pleural edema fluid, because it goes up into the pericardial sac, goes up into the pleural cavity, which is the lung cavity, and pulls out the transparent fluid from the lung cavity as well as the blood. And so the person who saw it thought it was blood and water. And it's line by line verification. And there's so much more to this shroud scientifically we can talk about in the crowd. But this is just the start. And the explanation for the image is absolutely mind-blowing, because it's going to have to be a radiation explanation.
Kind of speechless. I'm not like I'm in tears or anything about
No, it's
the
really
witness to what he did for us.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. And obviously, just on a really basic level here, you have a photographic negative. Before the world knew there was such a thing as a photographic negative.
Exactly.
That wasn't even someone who wanted to fake that would not have said, let's fake a photographic negative.
Exactly. Because, of course, they would have had to have produced a very strong source of radiation to do it. I don't think medieval forgers had any such thing in their mind. By the way, that 1988 carbon dating has been completely debunked.
Right, I was going to ask you about that. The annoying thing is that if you Google Shroud of Turin, one of the first things that comes up is a 1988 test, carbon dating, that they say, well, this isn't 2,000 years old, so therefore it's done.
Yeah, well, it's actually been debunked by 4 different tests. I mean,
what was the claim of that carbon dating test, and how was it debunked?
Yeah, the claim, well, first of all, the people who did the test violated the protocols that were called for in the 1978 Stirp investigation. So in 1988, they took one sample of the shroud from a very controversial corner that had been burned and then later mended by some nuns with a technique called invisible mending. And they took the one strand for the sample and cut it into 3 pieces. The original protocol called for 7 different spots on the linen shroud, none of which were controversial parts. Like, when you burn something, it adds carbon content, including C14 content as well. And then you have it mended by a thread from another era. This is going to throw everything
Obviously,
completely wackadoodle. Why they chose that particular thread is unknown. I could attribute some bad faith to it, but I guess I shouldn't. But the main thing, though, is in 1998, Dr. Ray Rogers over at Los Alamos Laboratories and the editor of Thermochemica, very prestigious peer-reviewed journal of thermal chemistry, he basically got some samples that were from the spot on the shroud where the sample had been taken. And he analyzed those samples and saw that there was cotton content in the area where the sample was taken. That would have been cotton content from where the sisters mended the shroud with cotton, and he also found the gum dye mordant to dye, the the cotton cloth to match the color of the linen. He found that also in the shroud. And so through pyrolysis and mass spectrometry and through the cotton content and a variety of other thermochemical tests, he said this sample did not come from the original linen of the cloth, disqualifying it to be dated.
Well, props to those sisters, because they did a pretty good job on that.
Yeah, oh, this invisible
bless them.
mending, truly an amazing technique. And then on top of that, you've got the Tristan Casabianca. He had tried to, he and his team, there's a very prestigious journal called Archaeometry at Oxford.
Archaeometry.
Yeah, archaeometry.
Okay.
And he basically he made requests of the British Museum to get the raw dating of the test. Well, he finally had to resort 30 years later, after constant requests, he has to resort to a Freedom of Information demand from the British Museum to give up the raw data from the testing. And there, lo and behold, when he had a mathematician, statistician actually do the run-through of the raw data, it clearly showed stratification and variegation that, obviously, if we get that kind of heterogeneity in a shroud sample, it either indicates there's a ton of carbon that got mixed in, or different threads from different ages that are being combined. And of course, immediately it disqualifies that sample as being a valid sample. Now, how could this be published?
I don't know how it's still getting circulated on the internet so much. Man, it drives me crazy.
It's been totally debunked.
But it's people who don't want to believe.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. And the Garlicelli and so forth have said from time immemorial that they don't want to believe this.
Right.
So
this is all in the will in the end, right? It's you choose to believe or not believe. The evidence is before us, but you have to decide for the evidence one way or the other. It's about a relationship, not a topic. But this stuff helps. It really helps to have good reasons for what we believe.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the shroud's been around for a long time. It's recorded about throughout the church's history, right? And people for the past few thousand years. Now, but in the past, when did it start being subject to just modern science and all these tests you're talking about? And what are some of the most compelling of these tests that this is?
Well, first, just with respect to the dating tests, a variety have been done since the carbon dating. The first one was, it was 3 tests done by Giulio Fanti, who is basically a testing, mechanical and thermochemical testing expert, and his group at the Italian National Labs. And they did a Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, a Raman laser spectroscopy.
Lucky dogs get in the shroud to test it like that. It's incredible. It's hard to get to that thing, right?
That's right. Oh, yeah, exactly. And mechanical compressibility and tension tests. He averaged all the weights of the various tests and came up with an age of 90 AD, plus or minus 150 years with a 95% confidence level.
So that's right in the time zone.
Right in the time zone. Yeah. And then recently, Liberato Ricaro and his group at the Italian National Labs did a they peer-reviewed a wide-angle X-ray scattering test, which is independent of carbon content. Basically, it's ambient secular temperature, test. And that one, he basically got an age of between 55 to 74 AD. Now, that was peer-reviewed over 3 years. So that test is a very highly accurate test.
Wow.
It tests the shroud. You obviously have to test it with spectral beforehand, spectral with sample cloths having spectral reflectance similar to that of the Shroud of Turin, and then the Shroud's samples match precisely those coming from between 55 to 74 AD.
Now, for the less scientific mind in there who's not assimilating all this information immediately, MagisCenter.com.
Yeah, exactly.
MagisCenter.com. All these reviewed papers, everything is on there.
Yeah.
All the resources about the Shroud of Turin
that
debunk the myth that it's just a myth.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. I want you to
I was
finish
just
the point.
going to just say the one thing, though, is the carbon dating test could not be valid because if the shroud were only 700 years old, then according to the wide-angle X-ray scattering test, the shroud would have had to have been in an ambient secular temperature of over the highest temperatures in the world for every single minute of its 700 years supposed existence, which of day and night, which of course is totally absurd.
Yeah.
So the carbon dating is just bunko debunked. But what's even more interesting is the face cloth of Oviedo in combination with it, because the face cloth of Oviedo is a face cloth it's got a provenance that goes back to 616 AD. And if you remember the Gospel of John,
Yes.
in there, when Peter and John go to the tomb and they're looking inside the tomb, John says, well, the beloved disciple saw that there was a face cloth rolled up in a separate place by itself, and the burial linens were, the shroud was in another place over here by itself.
Yeah.
Well, as it turns out, in 616 AD, we have now a permanent record of bishop to bishop, finally given, to Isidore of Seville, which is put into, a strong box, basically, in the Cathedral of Oviedo in 700 AD, and never gets moved again from 700 AD onwards. Now, what's interesting is...
Wait, have you looked at this face cloth?
Oh, absolutely.
Is it a matching face to the shroud?
Yeah, well, no, because there's no image on it. Remember, the face cloth in a crucifixion, when it was used to take the body from the cross, right? So they wrap it around the face, put the jaw up, put the cloth under the jaw, come around the top of the head, and bring it back down to the nape of the neck. And the reason was because this person would have been pummeled and bloodied, and there had been pleural edema fluid coming out of his nose, and his jaw would have been flopping. So they tried to make it, this is a beloved person. They didn't want to show the macabre face, so they basically brought it back to the tomb. Then they removed the face cloth. So this gets removed before the resurrection. On the other hand, so it gets the blood, but not the image. And by the way, on the shroud, as I'll be discussing, the blood preceded the image on the shroud. Because what happened is, as the image is produced, there is basically oxidation and dehydration, which produces friability in the cloth. And you can use electron microscopes. You can actually see whether or not there's friability underneath the bloodstain.
Friability.
Yeah, a little crispiness of the thread.
Literally
of
fry.
the fibrils. Yeah, sort of like sort of like that. But it just means a sort of a crispy consistency. That
So
crumbles.
The
crumbly
blood was
consistency.
somewhat fried by a blast of heat and light.
Well, actually, underneath it though, there is no image underneath that blood. So it basically means, imagine a forger putting all the blood there perfectly, anatomically, and then putting the image over the top of it.
Right. And speaking of that image, it's laughable to think that could be a forge. What kind of light would have been required?
Well, actually, if you do the ultraviolet radiation hypothesis, it would be 6 to 8 billion watts. That's like 500. Just think of like 500,000, 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy proceeding from every point in that body for 1/40 billionth of a second.
Hold on. I want you to say that again, because that is the most powerful resurrection image ever. Say that again a little slower.
6 to 8 billion watts of light energy, columnated vacuum ultraviolet radiation coming from that body. It's like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy coming out for 1/40 billionth of a second. That, to be honest with you, in order to get a 1/40 billionth of a second pulse, you'd have to use an ARF excimer laser. And if you use that laser, it would have to exceed all the ultraviolet laser radiation capacity we have in every laboratory of the world today, and it still could not produce that image. That's how powerful that image is.
That's how powerful the resurrection of Jesus is.
Yeah, if you imagine
That's
for one
seismic apostolic force, man. That's incredible.
It's not only that, but dead bodies normally don't do that. So you're going to have a supernatural cause, obviously. And so that image, it's so powerful, and it goes right over the blood. So the blood stains are there first, and then the image goes over, and it's a perfect anatomical match because it's the same body that's giving rise to the blood and to the radiation that produces
Praise
the
God.
image. But anyway, yeah.
Have we done studies on the blood itself?
Yes, we have.
What have we learned about the blood? We have any DNA samples? Do we, what are we able to get out of it?
Well, first of all, every of that 372 of those 372 blood stains, every single one of them is almost unsmeared, unfractioned. This is going to become very important in a moment. But also, it contains human hemoglobin. It has an AB blood type. It has human immunoglobulins. It has human whole blood. And it does have remnants of DNA molecular structures. But you don't have an amplifiable profile. But, I mean, let's face it, paint and dyes and rubs don't have DNA molecules. They don't have human immunoglobulins, human hemoglobin, or AB blood type for that matter.
AB positive, which is a universal recipient.
Yeah.
Which I would have thought maybe he'd have a universal donor, but no, he receives all of us.
Yeah.
We're grafted into the body of Christ.
Yeah, it's very unusual.
And I want to have you back to talk about Eucharistic miracles, but that's the blood type in the Eucharistic miracles.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. As a matter of fact, those blood.
Mind-blowing.
Oh, well,
It's mind-blowing.
The crucifixion story on it.
I want to hear what does this reveal about the suffering, about the story of what he went through.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, just as you can see, first of all, he was crowned with thorns, but a crown no medieval forger could have thought of, right? So, take
your time. Wow, what a profound meditation for Holy Week, for all this. Oh, man.
So, it's woven together. It's a thorn that is really prevalent in northern Judea and Jerusalem, but not other places outside of the Middle East.
They could tell that just by looking at the wound. What kind of thorn was that?
That's right, because you can see it has a curvature that's very, specific to a particular kind of thorn. And of course, on the top of in order to weave it together to keep it, in place, they had to put a top on the crown, which no medieval forger would have thought of. And furthermore, it would have caused more pain because there's a bunch of nerves that go right down the center of the skull, which are pretty, they're all getting, penetrated. So it's very, very, very painful. Wow. Then we know also that he was whipped with a Roman flagrum. No medieval forger would have thought that, they had a single-thonged whip, whereas the Romans had 3 thongs, and there were little lead dumbbells, little teeny lead dumbbells on the end of them. So when he's being whipped from the right and from the left. So there's 2 guys doing this, and of course, when it wraps around his side, and the dumbbells go into his side, and then it tears his flesh off when they take the whip back. Oh. Well, this is happening to him like, almost 200 times. And you look at that, the loss of blood, not to mention the pain, would have been excruciating. And it would have been unthinkable for the Romans really to do it this way, except in the case of Jesus, where we are given the explanation. Pontius Pilate wants to make him look like a train wreck so that, people will say, okay, he's been punished, no need to kill him. This is not a capital offense. He suffered as much as anybody deserves for calling himself, God's son and blaspheming. And of course, you look at, the charge of blasphemy, it's completely unique in Jewish and Roman juridical proceedings. Only in Jesus' case was the charge of blasphemy leveled against him. And by the way, the crown of thorns, the only reason that, we only have one crucifixion, the whole of history we know of, that where a person was crowned with thorns. But it makes sense in Jesus' case, King of the Jews, etc., etc. It makes sense in the narrative. Then that spear wound that I just talked about, I mean, where are you going to get blood and water and evidence of blood and water coming out of a wound? It had to actually, that spear had to go in at that 30-degree angle, which it did, and it have to go through the pleural edema into the pleural sac, but it had to go through the pericardial sac first. It's going to nick the heart, causing blood, go into the pleural edema sac, and so the water will flow. First the blood will come, then the pleural edema fluid, the transparent fluid.
And it's perfectly placed to have done that,
It's
as
perfect,
far as the image is concerned.
right between the fifth and sixth rib at the right angle to do precisely that. That's, of course, you know, we don't have crucifixions where the Romans are putting guys out of their misery. The whole point was to keep them crucified for 2 days.
Right.
And of course, in Jesus' case, he'd lost so much blood, and then, you know, the inexplicable spear wound, which is so clearly present. And then you can see that he carried his own, crossbeam on his shoulders, because he's got a big, huge lump and a dislocated shoulder. And so you can see by the scars on his knees that what happened was the man was carrying this crossbeam, and then he trips, and he goes right down on his knees.
They capture all this in the image.
From the image, absolutely. You can see it very clearly because of the angle. You can see that the beam went up and then bam, it hits his shoulder so hard that it not only dislocates his shoulder, but it jerks his neck around to the right. And then he becomes partially paralyzed on the upper right side. But you can see it because his eye is absorbed into the orbit, the right orbit, right? And it goes into a very abnormal, depression in the right orbit. So his eye got sucked in and made him paralyzed, which of course would obviously increase the pain of the crucifixion. And then the nail wounds are going to have to go into this, what's called the thenar furrow here, and it goes out this end, this little V that you can feel at the back of your wrist.
In the palm and out the wrist.
In the palm and out the wrist, and it about about a 15-degree angle or so, so that it comes out right here, right.
It's worse than just through the wrist, I think.
Right,
You got all
and
these nerves.
because it hits all the nerves on the way out, but fastens onto this little V-shaped bone, which of course holds the hands to the cross. So you look at what this poor man went through, the excruciating whipping. I mean, he had to lose. His flesh was just torn off his body. I mean, that's all there is to it. I mean, it's like a shark attack, where he's just torn to pieces by like a beast. And then finally, of course, when he gets to the cross and the nailing and having to pull himself up on the cross. I mean, the story, all the blood wounds are in place. And what's so interesting is that face cloth of Oviedo that goes back to 616 AD, that has 120 points of congruence in those irregular blood stains as the face of the man on the Shroud of Turin.
Wow.
120 points of congruence. Those two cloths had to touch the same face.
It almost makes you think this stuff's real.
Very real. And by the way, means also the cloth couldn't have been originated in medieval times, because the provenance of the face cloth of Oviedo is definitively 616 AD. And you can prove that through testimony after testimony, especially, sources like Isidore of Seville, and pilgrims visiting the face cloth in the Cathedral of Oviedo again and again. That's where it was placed in 700 AD. Well, if you look at that, and the two cloths touch the same face, guess what? The shroud has to go back to 616 or before. Or you're going to say, this is the most remarkable coincidence that's ever happened,
no.
and there's not even an image on the face cloth of Oviedo. I don't think so.
I love... Thank you. I mean, there's just so I could go on 2 hours on this. Go to magicenter.com and actually dive into this for the next 2 hours. Right now. Push the kids aside. They'll be fine. Put them in front of SpongeBob. Actually, no. Bring them with you to magicenter.com.
Yeah.
Dive into this mystery. I just love how this captures. His eyes aren't even open yet. You know, it captures the death, it tells the story of his death and the resurrection in one image.
Yeah.
The closed eyes, the suffering, the testament to what he went through out of love for us.
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
I thank God I made it through while you were saying without crying. But and then that to have that body, that dead body, have 500,000 spotlights come out of it in like a nanosecond.
That's spotlight, searchlights.
Searchlights.
That's a lot
Sorry,
of-
this is
that's a whole lot of light energy.
that's incredible. St. Paul tells us in Romans that God proved his love for us in this, that while we were sinners, he died for us. He died for you. There is a God. This is all real. There is a God. He created you for a purpose that's good. When you wanted from his plan, he could have redeemed you some other way. He chose to do it this way to show you how much he loves you. Next time you're wondering, can I make it past that sin? I want you to remember the message of the cross. Remember the message of the Mass. Same message, body of Christ. Do I matter? Body of Christ. Is anybody thinking about me? Body of Christ. Does my pain have purpose? Body of Christ. What's my net worth? Body of Christ. That's the answer to all the longings and questions in our hearts. God loved you so much that he died for you. And that's not the end of the story. He rose from the dead, which makes that death and all our deaths and all our pains in life profoundly beautiful. God love you. God love you, Father Spitzer. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Always my honor.
This is
Thanks,
just
Chris.
a rush. He is risen.
Yes,
We'll see you
he
next
is.
time. Man, wasn't that great? Listen, if you don't want to be happy, be sure not to subscribe. But if you want a more joyful life, the kind of life that God created you for, the kind of life Jesus promised when he said, I came to give you life to the full, then make sure you hit subscribe and share this channel with everybody you know.